In 1933, the legendary Egyptian writer Tawfiq al-Hakim published a novel called The Return of the Spirit. This novel drew from World War I and the 1919 Egyptian Revolution. It tells the story of a young man who wanted to break free from his family, moved to Cairo to make a living, and by a twist of fate, ended up participating in revolutionary demonstrations, eventually getting imprisoned. Among the many readers of this book was a 16-year-old young man who, like the protagonist of the novel, was also an outsider trying to make his way in Cairo. When this confused young man read the line, "The Egyptian people need someone who can voice their thoughts, someone who can be a shining symbol for them," he set his life goal, to become that person and lead the Egyptian people to liberation. That young man was none other than Gamal Abdel Nasser, who would later rule Egypt for nearly 20 years. After taking control of Egypt, Nasser repeatedly mentioned that the return of the spirit gave him his initial drive. However, the reason Nasser claimed that a novel inspired him to change Egypt was that before him, there were no real-world examples to follow. He was the first modern Middle Eastern military officer to succeed in a coup, and his experience became a template for many Middle Eastern strongmen, including Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. Today, let's talk about how to stage a Nasser-style coup. Since the 8th century, Egypt has been an important part of the Islamic world. In the 19th century, Egypt was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but during the rule of Muhammad Ali, Egypt fought wars with Turkey to compete for leadership over the Arab world. After the construction of the Suez Canal, Egypt's size and importance grew to the point that its nominal connection to the Ottomans was barely more than a formality. Such an important region could not escape the attention of Western colonialists. In the late 19th century, the British first gained control of the Suez Canal through economic means, and later, through war with Egypt, they turned it into a British protectorate. In 1936, on the eve of World War II, Britain renegotiated and signed the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty with Egypt. Egypt gained limited internal governance rights, but its foreign policy, military, and control over the Suez Canal all remained under British control. Although this was seen as a significant concession by the British, the treaty's content fell far short of the independence that Egyptians desired. That same year, an 18-year-old Nasser graduated from high school. At that time, he was already a staunch activist and believed that armed struggle was the only way to free Egypt from British control. Nasser aspired to attend Egypt's Royal Military Academy, but even though the Egyptian army was nominally Egyptian, its officers were handpicked by the British and were essentially puppets. Nasser, with his history of protests, was naturally rejected from the military academy. However, not everyone in the Egyptian military believed that British rule over Egypt was justified. With the help of a sympathetic Egyptian deputy minister of the army, Nasser was able to bypass the academy's screening process and finally enroll in the Royal Military Academy. Once he achieved his goal of becoming a member of the military, Nasser, in addition to focusing on learning military skills, did one other crucial thing, something that would become a key part of any successful coup. Nasser's ability to bypass the military academy's admission process was largely thanks to the personal sympathy of the deputy army minister. But sympathy for the Egyptian revolution, and even active support for it, was not limited to those within the government. Many of Nasser's classmates at the Royal Military Academy shared similar sentiments. During his studies and after graduation, Nasser focused on building relationships with these officers inside the Egyptian military, who were eager to remove British influence in some way. Before long, a secret group of officers was formed. Up to that point, Egypt's military had not been tested in any wars. During the recently concluded World War II, Egypt's army largely remained on the sidelines, watching the war unfold near its borders. This secret group of officers didn't even know if they could actually mobilize the Egyptian military, let alone defeat the British. But fortune favors the prepared. When Israel declared independence, Arabs, who had long resented Jewish immigration, formed a coalition in 1948 in an attempt to crush the newly formed state of Israel. This war turned into a disaster for the Arab nations. With the help of both the US and the Soviet Union, the fledgling state of Israel survived the initial attacks and soon launched a counteroffensive. Nasser's unit was surrounded by Israeli forces during this first Arab-Israeli war, but he chose not to surrender and endured nearly 3 months of Israeli bombardment until the war ended. While this did not change the outcome of the Arab defeat, Nasser's perseverance in the war became one of the few bright spots in the Arab army's efforts. To make the defeat less humiliating, The Egyptian media began to heavily promote Nasser's courage in the face of the enemy. They fabricated many stories about his wartime heroics, including classic tales of leading a kitchen brigade through enemy fire. The Egyptian public's enthusiasm for Nasser quickly overshadowed the shame of the defeat. Nasser also earned the nickname the Tiger of Fallujah for his time surrounded by Israeli forces in Palestine. Faced with the public's fervor, Nasser, although aware that his military achievements were greatly exaggerated, was more focused on how to use this passion to his advantage. The year after the first Arab-Israeli war, Nasser, riding the wave of media-created popularity, became the undisputed leader of the secret group of officers. In 1949, Nasser named his organization the Free Officers Association, setting its ultimate goal as the restoration of Egypt's national dignity and freedom. At this point, the groundwork for a successful coup was complete. A leader with prestige and an organization of individuals with shared backgrounds and common interests. Now Nasser needed the right moment to spark change. In the 1950 Egyptian elections, the reform-seeking Wafdi party won. However, once in office, the party struggled to pass any significant policies, wavering between the British and Americans. In an attempt to break the deadlock, in a moment of heated decision-making in 1951, Wafdi party politicians decided to fully confront the British. They unilaterally annulled the 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty and reclaimed Egypt's sovereignty over the Suez Canal. The British were astonished by the Wafd Party's unilateral actions, as the Suez Canal was a critical lifeline for the British Empire. When the Wafd Party incited the Egyptian people to attack the Suez Canal zone, the 7,000 British soldiers stationed there quickly took action. They ordered the Egyptian police who were standing by to disarm, and when they refused, the British soldiers opened fire on them. When news of the heavy Egyptian police casualties reached Cairo, the Egyptian people's simmering resentment toward the British boiled over. They attacked every foreigner in Cairo and set fire to shops owned by foreign merchants. The Wafd Party initially hoped that the public's resistance would force Britain to make concessions. However, it soon became clear that Britain was willing to fight for the Suez Canal. When the Wafd Party realized that they had lost control of the situation, they swiftly dismissed the Nahas government and within the party, appointed 3 different politicians in succession to take over. Yet, none of these leaders could restore the situation to how it was before the Anglo-Egyptian conflict. The Egyptian monarchy's weakness and inability to act further stoked public anger. Witnessing Egypt's turmoil, Nasser felt the time for a coup had arrived. He moved the planned coup, originally scheduled for late 1952, up to July 1952. At the time, Nasser was only 34 years old and held the rank of colonel. To increase the chances of a successful coup, he decided not to position himself as its public leader. Instead, he put forward 51-year-old General Mohammed Naguib, a lieutenant general in the Egyptian army, as the figurehead. In hindsight, this step proved unnecessary and ultimately caused difficulties for the free officers, as Naguib's outdated views, even though he was only a nominal leader, hindered reforms. On the early morning of July 22nd, Nasser made his move. As Naguib broadcast the free officers' demands to the Egyptian people, Nasser's officers took just a few hours to control all the senior officers within the Egyptian military. 3 days later, the Egyptian king fled with his life, and his underage son became a mere figurehead for the free officers until they abolished the monarchy. The free officers, relying on a group of mid- and lower-level military officers, took control of Egypt without much bloodshed. They succeeded thanks to a prestigious and energetic leader, a military group with a shared goal, and a temporarily chaotic domestic and international situation. In fact, as long as these 3 elements came together, a successful coup could be staged in many Arab nations during the mid-20th century. The overall instability of the Arab world allowed military leaders with just a small faction to seize power in their respective countries. Gaddafi's takeover of Libya was almost a carbon copy of the Egyptian coup, and the rise of Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party in Iraq shared many parallels with Nasser's coup, both in terms of personnel sources and the form of the coup. However, while a coup might seem straightforward, Nasser didn't have much power to wield at the time, and due to Naguib's presence, there were internal divisions within the free officers about how to reshape post-coup Egypt. If not for one particular choice, Nasser's place in history might not have been any higher than that of Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi. But Nasser's first decision after the successful coup ultimately changed his fate once again, and it cemented his place in Egyptian history as a revolutionary leader.